I was halfway through folding a load of laundry when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and I almost let it go to voicemail, because who answers those anymore, right? But something made me pick it up. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was just a nurse's intuition, but as soon as I heard the panicked voice on the other end, my stomach dropped. "Are you Haley?" the woman asked quickly. "There are 2 kids here, Riley and Dylan, they said you're their aunt. They were just dropped off by an Uber and they're standing on my porch crying. They're freezing." I didn't know what else to do but call the number they gave me. For a split second, I couldn't even process what she was saying. I felt this electric jolt go through my chest as my brain caught up. Riley and Dylan. My sister Sandra's kids. What the hell? Where are you? I asked, already scrambling for my keys. The woman rattled off an address on Maple Street and I froze for a second. Maple Street? I live on Maple Drive. The difference of one word, street instead of drive, was all it took to completely upend everything. I didn't even bother changing out of my sweats. I grabbed my coat, phone, and bag and bolted out the door, the laundry forgotten in a half-sorted pile. My car barely had time to warm up before I peeled out of the driveway, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My mind was going 100 miles an hour. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why would Sandra send her kids to my place without even checking if I was home? And through an Uber, no less? Traffic wasn't horrible, thank God, but every red light felt like it lasted a century. I kept glancing at my phone on the passenger seat, checking and rechecking the address. Maple Street. Not Drive. Just a stupid, tiny mistake, but with kids, that's not just a mistake. That's a disaster. I finally turned onto the street and spotted the house almost immediately. It was a modest little bungalow, front porch light casting a soft yellow glow across the snow-covered yard. And there they were. Riley, in her too-thin purple jacket, sitting on the front step with Dylan curled into her side, his face buried in her shoulder. A woman in flannel pajama pants and a heavy winter coat was crouched next to them, speaking gently. I slammed the car into park and rushed out before the engine even fully stopped. "Riley. Dylan." I called, and Riley's head snapped up so fast I thought she might hurt herself. Her face crumpled the second she saw me and she burst into tears. Dylan looked up, his cheeks red from the cold, and he immediately let go of his sister and ran toward me. I dropped to my knees in the snow and caught him, wrapping my arms around his tiny shivering body. Riley followed, burying her face in my neck as I tried to envelop them both with my coat. They were ice cold. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I murmured over and over, stroking their hair, kissing their heads. I didn't even know what else to say. I was still shaking myself. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. The woman who had called me stood nearby, clearly relieved. They said they were supposed to go to their Aunt Haley's house, but the Uber dropped them off here. I looked it up and figured maybe they meant Maple Drive. I didn't want to just leave them outside. I thanked her profusely. She said it was no problem, that she was just glad someone had come for them. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read, somewhere between sympathy and incredulity, but I didn't have time to unpack that. I was too focused on getting the kids into my warm car and blasting the heat. Once we were inside, Dylan was still clinging to me like a lifeline, and Riley just kept whispering, "I thought you weren't coming. I thought you weren't home." My hands were trembling as I strapped them in. I had a million questions but none I wanted to ask in that moment, not while they were still trying to stop crying, not while their little teeth were chattering. I just needed to get home, get them warm, and get them safe. Back at my place, I pulled out all the blankets I could find, made them cocoa with way too many marshmallows, and let them sit on the couch wrapped up like little burritos. I put on a movie I knew they liked, something with talking animals, and just sat there with them, trying to stay calm while my mind went into overdrive. Sandra hadn't called. No text. No missed call. No heads up that she was sending her kids to me, let alone with a stranger in an Uber. It was like she just decided I'd be home, assumed I'd be ready to take over without even confirming. What if I hadn't answered the phone? What if I'd been out running errands, or still at work? What if those kids had been left on that porch alone for hours? I tried not to spiral, but it was impossible not to. I work in a hospital. I see what happens to kids when people make careless decisions. And this was beyond careless. Riley eventually fell asleep curled up on the couch, Dylan tucked against her with a blanket pulled up to his chin. I just sat in the chair across from them, watching them sleep, my heart still pounding hours later. It didn't feel real. It felt like some twisted dream. Like I'd wake up any second and it would all be fine. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And the longer I sat there, the angrier I got. Sandra had done a lot of reckless things over the years, but this felt like something else. This wasn't just forgetfulness or flakiness. This was dangerous. And she hadn't even called to check. Hadn't made sure I was home, or that they'd gotten to the right place. She'd just washed her hands of them, like it was someone else's problem. At some point I picked up my phone and stared at the screen, debating whether to call her. I didn't. I couldn't. I didn't trust myself not to scream the second she picked up. So instead I just sat there, in my own living room, watching over her kids like they were mine, because apparently I was the only one who cared enough to do it right. Sandra has always been the golden one, the type of person who walks into a room and somehow everyone shifts toward her, like she's the center of gravity. For years older than me, and from the moment we were kids, it was obvious who the favorite was. She had this effortless charm, big, glossy eyes, a movie star smile, and the kind of charisma that made adults chuckle indulgently even when she was being cruel. I used to watch her glide through life like she had some sort of immunity, like consequences didn't apply to her. And the thing is, they never really did. While I was the one who got grounded for AB+ or scolded for missing curfew by 10 minutes, Sandra could disappear for an entire weekend and come back to warm hugs and "we're just glad you're safe." Our mother would sit at the kitchen table beaming at her, proudly brushing aside anything that hinted at disapproval. "She's just spirited," Mom would say, like that explained why Sandra never lifted a finger while I was scrubbing floors or cooking dinner at 13. I used to tell myself I was imagining it. That I was just jealous. But it got harder to ignore as we got older. When she flunked out of her first college, my parents sent her to another one, no questions asked. When she crashed her first car, it was replaced within a week. When I needed help paying for textbooks during nursing school, I was told to apply for more hours at work. They'd already done enough. And when Sandra became a mom, that was the moment everyone thought the fantasy would finally dissolve. The hope was that motherhood would ground her, maybe anchor her to something real. For a while, we all held our breath waiting for the switch to flip. But Sandra didn't transform, she just found new ways to escape. From the outside, she looked like the picture of young motherhood, 2 beautiful kids, perfect social media snapshots, outfits always matching, captions full of heart emojis and fake deep quotes about how hard but rewarding it all is. But that was all it ever was, a picture. A performance. Behind the curated posts, she was still the same Sandra, irresponsible, impulsive, utterly unwilling to sacrifice an ounce of her comfort. When Riley was born, Sandra was living in a 1-bedroom apartment that she barely kept clean. She refused to work, said she was focusing on being a full-time mom, but somehow still managed to be out several nights a week. I remember showing up one time, unannounced, to bring her groceries because she'd called me crying about being broke. Riley was 6 months old, sitting in a swing, screaming her lungs out, her diaper leaking. Sandra wasn't even home. The neighbor said she'd left 20 minutes earlier with some guy in a black Jeep. I sat on that couch, feeding Riley a bottle with one hand and texting Sandra with the other, asking where the hell she was. She showed up 2 hours later, laughing like it was no big deal, like I was the dramatic one for being upset. I didn't say anything then. I just handed Riley over, grabbed my keys, and left. That was the first time I felt that hollow pit in my chest, the one that forms when you realize you're more of a mother to your sister's kid than she is. By the time Dylan came along, it was no longer shocking. It was just the new normal. She moved back in with Mom for a while after his birth, said it was just until she figured things out. Mom did most of the diaper changes, I picked Riley up from preschool on my way home from 12-hour shifts, and Sandra spent her time bouncing between flings and MLMs. She was selling makeup 1 month, detox teas the next. Always chasing something flashy, something easy, something that didn't involve being tied down. And then, when Mom got sick, everything fell apart. It wasn't sudden, we'd seen it coming for months, but when it finally happened, it hit like a bomb. Mom was the only buffer between Sandra and the rest of reality. Without her, it was like all the chaos Sandra had ever caused became mine to clean up. No one else stepped up. There was no dad in the picture. Our aunts? too distant, too disapproving. So everything fell on me. I became the person who made sure Riley had new coats each winter and Dylan had shoes that actually fit. I filled out their school forms, made doctor's appointments, rearranged my shifts to make it to parent-teacher conferences because Sandra forgot or couldn't make it. I was the one who canceled dates, skipped weekends away, and quietly handed over money I didn't really have, because I couldn't stand to see those kids suffer for their mother's mistakes. And still, Sandra lived like a childless socialite. She was always between things, between jobs, between places to live, between phases of self-discovery. One month she was meditating and manifesting, the next, she was talking about moving to LA to start a podcast. I kept waiting for her to grow up, to take responsibility, to do anything other than float through life in her curated bubble. But it never happened. Sometimes I'd look at her and feel like I was staring at someone from another world. She'd come by to pick up the kids in sunglasses and a silk blouse, talking about a new wellness event she was attending. I'd be in scrubs, dog-tired from an overnight shift, with a sink full of dishes and bags under my eyes from being up all night with Dylan when he had a fever. She never noticed. Or if she did, she didn't care. I didn't mind doing things for the kids. I love them. That's never been in question. But there's a different kind of pain that sets in when the people around you just assume you'll be the one who sacrifices. When no one asks if you're okay, because being the reliable one means they forget you have limits. Sandra never asked. Not once. She never thanked me either, not sincerely. There were moments when she'd throw around compliments like currency. "I don't know how you do it," she'd say with that breezy laugh, as if I'd just stumbled into competency. Or she'd tag me in some Instagram post about being the best aunt ever, like that balanced out the days and weeks I spent raising her kids while she chased attention from strangers online. Even after Mom died, there was no shift. No epiphany. Just more dodging, more disappearing acts. I remember being at the funeral reception and overhearing her tell one of Mom's friends how Haley's really stepped into the role of caretaker, she's so nurturing, like I was some volunteer who happened to show up, not the exhausted sister who had no other choice. That was the thing about Sandra. She knew how to spin a story so well that even when you were drowning, you'd start to wonder if maybe you were just imagining it. Maybe she wasn't so bad. Maybe you were being too harsh. But then the next crisis would hit, the missed school pickup, the empty fridge, the forgotten birthday, and I'd be right back where I always was, trying to pick up the pieces of the mess she left behind. When Sandra called me that night, I was lying on my couch with a hot compress pressed against my forehead, trying to will away the pounding behind my eyes. I was already 2 days into a flu that felt like it was trying to kill me, the kind of illness where your bones ache, your skin feels too tight, and you can't keep food down. I'd worked 6 shifts back-to-back that week, covering for 2 nurses who had quit with no notice, and by the time Friday rolled around, I was a wreck, burned out, sleep-deprived, running on crackers and sports drinks. My body had simply shut down. I hadn't even answered the first time she called. She left a voicemail, chirping in that usual breezy tone that always sounds like she's half listening to something else while she talks. "Hey, Hales, I've got a last-minute thing tonight, can you watch the kids? I'll only be gone a few hours. Thanks, love you." I didn't call her back immediately. I waited, debating whether to force myself to stand up and reply. But then the phone rang again. This time I answered, already dreading it. "I really can't tonight," I said before she could launch into whatever excuse she'd come up with. "I'm sick, Sandra. Like actually sick. Fever, chills, the works. I haven't slept. I can barely stand up. You'll need to find someone else." There was a beat of silence, just long enough for me to know she was about to turn it into a thing. Then came the sigh, the annoyed exhale she always does when she's about to pretend like she's the one being inconvenienced. "Seriously? You're not even working tonight, are you?" she said, her voice hardening with that familiar mix of entitlement and disbelief, like my personal well-being was somehow a betrayal to her. "I'm not working because I'm sick," I repeated, more sharply this time. "I'm not in any shape to take care of anyone else right now. I need rest." I said no. Another pause. Longer this time. "Well, fine," she snapped, and then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, half expecting her to call back in 5 minutes with some guilt-tripping message or a voice note about how I was letting her down, how overwhelmed she was. But nothing came. I assumed, foolishly, that she'd gotten the message and made other arrangements. Maybe called a babysitter, maybe stayed home. Maybe, for once, she'd respected a boundary. I fell asleep on the couch soon after, still bundled in 3 layers of blankets, sweating and shivering all at once, the TV playing some documentary I wasn't really watching. I didn't think about it again until that phone call came from the woman on Maple Street, her voice tense and urgent as she told me there were 2 kids on her porch, 2 kids who said I was their aunt. By the time I got to the house and saw Riley and Dylan, trembling in the cold, huddled together on a stranger's stoop, something inside me cracked wide open. Riley's face was red, streaked with tears, her lips blue at the corners, her little hands clutching Dylan like she thought he might slip away. Dylan was so cold he couldn't even speak, just looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes and buried his face into my coat when I picked him up. They were both underdressed, no hats, no scarves, just thin coats and 2 light shoes. Riley's leggings were soaked at the knees, and Dylan's hands were bare, raw from the wind. And it hit me all at once, this wasn't a bad night. This wasn't a one-off. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, and it had always been a pattern. Sandra hadn't misunderstood me. She hadn't forgotten to double-check. She had heard me say no, clearly, directly, finally, and then decided that my answer didn't matter. That her wants still came first, no matter what. She packed her kids into a stranger's car and sent them across the city, alone, in the middle of winter, to a house she didn't verify, with no guarantee anyone would be there. She just washed her hands of them, as if I were some kind of backup service she could activate whether I agreed or not. And what if I hadn't picked up that call? What if that woman on Maple Street hadn't been kind? What if it had been the wrong house in a worse neighborhood, or if the kids had wandered off, scared and confused, trying to find my place in the dark? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how close we had come to disaster, real disaster. Sandra hadn't just been reckless. She had put her children in harm's way because she was mad I wouldn't save her again. It wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. When I brought the kids home and tucked them in with extra blankets, warm cocoa in their bellies, I sat at the foot of the couch for hours, watching the rise and fall of their breathing, thinking about every single time I'd picked up the slack for her. Every coat I'd bought. Every night I'd driven across town because she forgot a pickup. Every time I'd taken a personal day to be at school events she didn't even remember existed. And this was what it led to. This was how far she would go. It broke something in me I didn't even realize could still be broken. That night, I wasn't just angry. I was done. The kind of done where you stop hoping they'll change. The kind where the silence afterward doesn't hurt anymore because it finally feels like peace. After I got the kids warm and fed, after I bathed them and wrapped them in the softest blankets I had, after I checked their temperatures and made sure their fingers were no longer stiff from the cold, I sat on the edge of the couch with my phone in my lap, staring at Sandra's contact photo for a long time. Riley had fallen asleep with her head on my shoulder, her little fingers curled around the edge of my sleeve like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. Dylan had finally stopped shivering, curled up on the other end of the couch with one of my throw pillows hugged tight to his chest. They were safe, finally, but I wasn't calm. I was shaking in a different way, hot, brittle, electric with a kind of anger I'd never let myself feel fully before. I tapped her name and put the phone to my ear. It rang twice before she answered.
Hello?
She sang out, her voice already slurring slightly. I could hear music in the background, voices, laughter. She was out. Still on her damn date. Still pretending like she hadn't just nearly abandoned her kids in the freezing cold. It's me, I said, my voice low and flat, because I was doing everything I could to keep from screaming. We need to talk. Oh my God, you're such a buzzkill, she said, giggling. Are they there? See, I knew you'd come through. You always change your mind. I felt something snap in my chest. I didn't change my mind, I said, every word sharp and deliberate. I told you no. I told you I was sick. I told you I couldn't do it tonight. Okay, she drawled. Calm down. They're fine, right? Fine? I repeated, incredulous. Dylan's lips were blue, Sandra. He was shaking so hard he couldn't speak. Riley was crying on a stranger's porch because they got dropped off at the wrong house. They were cold. Alone. Scared. And you're out drinking like nothing happened. There was a pause. I could hear a man's voice in the background, muffled laughter, clinking glasses. You're being dramatic, she said finally. They said they were going to your house. It's not like I sent them into a war zone. You sent them in an Uber, without confirming if I was even home. You didn't check the address. You didn't check in. You didn't do anything except dump your kids on someone else and hope it worked out. And it didn't. It could have ended very, very badly. She sighed. Actually sighed. God, Haley. You've always been so intense about everything. They're fine. You're fine. I don't know why you're blowing this up like it's some kind of crime. I stood up, pacing now, my free hand clenched in a fist. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No apology. No fear. No concern. Just that same dismissiveness, that same spoiled, flippant tone she'd used her whole life when someone tried to make her face the damage she caused. This ends tonight, I said, cutting through whatever excuse she was about to launch into. My voice was ice. No more excuses. No more disappearing. No more dumping your kids on me without asking. No more treating motherhood like it's optional. You want to keep living like some carefree influencer, chasing dates and pretending you're still 20? Fine. But not at their expense. Not on my time. You want to be a mother? Then be one. If not. She laughed, like she thought I was bluffing. If not, I said again, slower now, quieter, dead serious, then you're going to lose them. I will not be part of this anymore. I will not watch you fail them over and over while pretending everything's fine. I will not be the safety net you assume will always catch them. You don't get to have it both ways. Be a mother, or lose them. Your choice. She didn't say anything right away. For once, Sandra was silent. No smart-ass reply. No flirty giggle. Just silence, and then the distant sound of music as she pulled the phone away from her mouth, like I was some background noise she could mute. You're so dramatic, she mumbled finally. It's not that deep. I hung up before she could finish. My hand was shaking, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed in my ears. I sat back down on the couch, between the two sleeping children, and pulled the blanket up higher around Riley's shoulders. I didn't say anything out loud, but in my head, the words replayed like a vow, this ends tonight. 3 weeks passed after that night, after the call, after the ultimatum. 3 whole weeks of silence. No texts. No sarcastic voice notes. No Instagram tags of the kids in their mismatched clothes or her filtered selfies with captions about mom life and iced coffee. It was the kind of quiet that should have felt like relief, but it didn't. It felt like waiting for a crash you knew was coming. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, expecting another emergency. But nothing came. I still picked Riley and Dylan up once or twice during that time, pre-planned, pre-agreed, but it was always me confirming everything, me double-checking pickup times, me bringing extra snacks because I knew Sandra wouldn't have packed anything. She never said a word about our last conversation. She acted like it never happened. Like the screaming, the near hypothermia, the threat I made, none of it stuck. It was typical Sandra, move through life like it's a party, let someone else deal with the aftermath. And for a brief second, I actually thought maybe she'd gotten scared straight. Maybe she was trying to prove she could handle it. But deep down, I knew better. I was in the middle of a 12-hour shift when the school called. It was the receptionist, and she sounded hesitant, like she didn't want to say what she had to say. Hi, Haley. Sorry to bother you at work. We've been trying to reach Sandra, but there's been no answer. It's nearly 4 o'clock, and Riley and Dylan haven't been picked up. I froze, the pen in my hand going still mid-chart. I looked at the clock. It was late. Pickup was supposed to be at 3. Did she confirm she was coming today? I asked, already pulling my bag out from under the nurse's station. She sent an email this morning. Just said she'd be here. No follow-up. I was out of the hospital in less than 3 minutes, still in my scrubs, badge clipped to my collar, heart racing the whole drive across town. The whole way there, I kept thinking, maybe her car broke down. Maybe she lost track of time. Maybe something happened. But even those excuses felt thin, like they were made for someone else, not Sandra. Not the woman who sent her kids across the city in an Uber without so much as a text. The kids were sitting on a bench outside the school office when I got there. Riley's backpack was on the ground next to her, and Dylan was leaning into her side, half asleep. She looked up when I came in, and that look, tired, quiet, too calm for a 7-year-old, hit me like a punch to the ribs. She didn't come, Riley said softly. I know, baby, I said, kneeling in front of them. I'm here now. I signed them out and buckled them into my car, making sure they had snacks, water, something to hold them over. Then I drove straight to Sandra's apartment, anger boiling under my skin the whole way, not hot and reckless but cold and precise, measured. I didn't knock when I got there. I used the spare key I knew she kept under the flower pot like it was still 2009 and she thought nothing bad could happen. The second I opened the door, the smell hit me, stale wine, sweat, takeout containers, something sour and unwashed. The place was dark. Curtains drawn. TV glowing in the corner, low volume, some reality show flickering across the screen. The living room was a mess, laundry in a pile on the floor, empty cups, a bowl of something crusted over on the coffee table. And Sandra was on the couch, half sprawled, one leg dangling off the side, arm over her eyes like a cliché. Her hair was matted on one side, mascara smudged into the corner of her cheek. A nearly empty bottle of wine sat next to her, the glass still half full, untouched. I stood there for a minute, letting the scene sink in. Letting the stench of neglect wrap around me like proof. Sandra, I said sharply, loud enough to jolt her. She didn't move. Just groaned, barely lifting her arm to peer out from under it. What? She muttered, voice hoarse, dry. You missed pickup, I said, walking further in, stepping over a crumpled jacket. You left your children sitting outside their school for over an hour. They were scared. Again. She grunted, barely acknowledging me, eyes fluttering shut again. I was tired. Tired? I repeated, stunned. You were passed out with a wine bottle on the table. I had a headache, she snapped, sitting up slowly, wincing. You're being dramatic again. My fists clenched at my sides. I wasn't even surprised anymore. Just numb. Numb and done. They were sitting on a bench, Sandra, I said, each word clear, deliberate. Alone. In the cold. You didn't answer your phone. You didn't reply to the school. You didn't even check the time. She stood up unsteadily, brushing past me toward the kitchen, still not looking me in the eye. You got them, though, right? So what's the big deal? That broke me. That right there. The big deal, I said, following her, my voice rising now, is that they are not mine to save. I am not their mother. You are. And every time I pick up the pieces of your mess, you get worse. You treat them like afterthoughts and me like a built-in backup. And I'm done. She turned, finally, and her face was flushed, eyes bloodshot. She looked like hell. And for a second, I thought I saw something, guilt, shame, something human, but it vanished as quickly as it came. If you don't like it, she said, voice flat, get out. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly Sandra. Deflect. Blame. Dismiss. Always. I was already on my way, I said, grabbing the diaper bag off the floor, even though Dylan hadn't used diapers in years. But let me make this clear before I go. This isn't just a warning. This isn't a threat. This is the end of the line. If you don't get your life together, if you keep putting those kids in danger, I will do whatever it takes to protect them. With or without you. She didn't respond. She just turned away and lit a cigarette like I wasn't even in the room. I left, and I didn't look back. Because I wasn't finished. I was just getting started. The night I found Sandra passed out on the couch, wine bottle tipped at an angle on the table and the apartment steeped in that dense, fermented smell of cheap alcohol and stale air, something inside me settled, not with peace, but with certainty. I had crossed the line of hoping she'd change. I had stopped waiting for the apology. I had stopped expecting her to be who she was supposed to be. That was the night I started documenting everything. I went home and sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, phone beside me, photos pulled up in my gallery, images I didn't even realize I'd been collecting out of reflex. Riley's shoes with the split soles. The inside of their fridge the last time I was there, nearly empty, just condiments, a half-eaten yogurt, and a bottle of something green and expired. A screenshot of the Uber receipt with the wrong address. The timestamp from the school pickup that never happened. The voicemail I saved, where the school receptionist's voice faltered as she tried to politely explain that no one had come for the kids. I created a folder on my desktop, titled it plainly, Riley and Dylan, Documentation. I opened a Word doc and started typing, logging everything I could remember. The Uber incident. The missed pickups. The day Riley came to my apartment in February without gloves and her fingers red to the knuckles. I wrote it all down, dates, times, conversations. I didn't embellish. I didn't add emotion. I wrote like a nurse, like someone used to recording facts in a chart that might someday have to stand up in court. But it wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. I'd passed that point. I was doing this for them, for Riley, who had stopped talking about her mom's house like it was home, and for Dylan, who never cried when it was time to leave, who just quietly slipped his hand into mine like he knew I wouldn't forget to buckle his seatbelt or leave him waiting in the cold. The final straw came 4 days later. I picked the kids up after school again. Sandra had asked me to help out just this once, her voice strained like she was performing concern, like she wanted me to believe she was trying. When I saw Dylan that afternoon, I knew something was wrong. His face was flushed, the rims of his eyes glassy, and he coughed into his sleeve with a deep, raw sound that rattled in his chest. He didn't talk much on the ride back. Just rested his head against the car window, blinking slowly, breathing in shallow puffs. I asked Riley if he'd been sick all day, and she nodded. He had a fever last night, she said softly. He told Mommy, but she said it was probably just from the hot shower. By the time I got him to my apartment and took his temperature, it was pushing 103. I didn't hesitate. I packed him into the car again and drove straight to urgent care. I didn't even call Sandra. I was past that. The intake nurse looked him over and ordered a chest x-ray almost immediately. The doctor came back 20 minutes later with a pinched expression and the word bronchitis. He said it was severe, on the verge of turning into pneumonia if it hadn't already begun. I remember how he looked at me when I gave him Dylan's insurance info and explained I wasn't his legal guardian, just his aunt. Was his mother aware he was this sick, he asked, pressing his pen against the clipboard. She was told, I said carefully. She didn't bring him in. The doctor paused. Then he made a note. I knew what that meant. I knew the words he was writing down. Medical neglect. At-risk child. I knew, because I'd written those same phrases in patient files myself. But this time, it wasn't someone else's chart. It wasn't a family I didn't know. It was Dylan. It was us. They gave him a breathing treatment and a round of antibiotics, and I watched him curl up on the exam table like a kitten, eyes closed, his chest still moving too fast under the paper gown. That was the moment I felt it, the shift from watching to acting. I had been the fallback for too long. I had seen too much. And now, I couldn't stay silent and tell myself I was doing enough. I brought him back to my apartment that night. Sat him down with soup, gave him his medicine, tucked him in on the pull-out bed in my living room. Then I sat down at the same kitchen table where I'd started documenting everything and opened a browser tab. I searched for the number to Child Protective Services. My hands trembled. My throat felt tight. Not from guilt, but from the sheer weight of it, what it meant, what would follow, what it might do to our family, fractured as it already was. I thought about Riley, about how she had started looking over her shoulder when we walked out of school, like she wasn't sure who was coming for her anymore. I thought about Dylan's lips, blue in the cold that night he was left at the wrong address. And I thought about Sandra, passed out while her son's lungs burned. I dialed. The line rang. Then a voice answered, calm and professional. I need to report suspected neglect, I said. My voice didn't waver. It's about my sister's children. I have documentation. I have proof. I'm not sure what happens next. But I can't let this go any further. That was the moment the line was crossed. The moment I chose to stop being the one who picked up the pieces and started being the one who refused to let them break again. The call to CPS was on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, the fallout had already begun. Sandra must have gotten the visit first thing because by 9:13 a.m., I had 5 missed calls and 2 voicemails from her, both incoherent rants laced with curses and sobs and accusations that made my stomach turn even though I knew I had done the right thing. The first message started with screaming, actual screaming, not words, just this guttural, rage-fueled noise like she couldn't form a coherent thought through her fury. "You heartless bitch," she spat once she found her words, her voice raw, shaking. "You called F******************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************$ $$$$$$$$$$$$$$$$$ You've ruined my life. You've ruined everything. How could you do this to me? The second voicemail was quieter, but meaner. Her voice had gone cold. You always hated me, she said, almost calm now. This was about jealousy. It's always been about jealousy. Because you're bitter. Because no one ever looked at you the way they looked at me. Admit it. That's what this is. You wanted to punish me. Well, congratulations. She hung up after that. No apology. No fear for her kids. No acknowledgement that she'd left a sick child untreated, or let them wait alone outside a school, or dump them into an Uber without even verifying the destination. Just rage. Just blame. By the time I checked my texts, it had already reached the rest of the family. My father, who hadn't spoken more than a few words to me in months, sent a message so clipped and cold it felt like a slap. We don't turn on our own. I hope you're proud of what you've done. My aunt called half an hour later. I didn't pick up, so she left a voicemail too, her voice shaking with judgment wrapped in that syrupy tone she always used to scold people while pretending she wasn't. Haley, I can't believe you'd take things this far. Family is sacred. You don't go airing dirty laundry to strangers. What you've done is unforgivable. You could have handled this privately, like an adult, like a sister. My cousin Laura jumped into the mess later that night. She texted me directly, just 3 words that burned like acid, "You're ice cold." The sheer speed of it all stunned me. The way they closed ranks around Sandra without hesitation, without context, without ever asking what I'd seen, what I'd documented, what those kids had endured. They weren't interested in the pictures of Riley in torn leggings in 30-degree weather, or the photo of Dylan's half-eaten breakfast that was just a bag of plain tortilla chips, or the timestamps from the missed pickups. None of them asked about the medical notes from urgent care, or the mold in the kids' bedroom at Sandra's apartment, or the bruises Riley got from tripping over cluttered junk piles because there was no clear floor space left. None of it mattered. What mattered to them was the betrayal. Not of the kids, but of the image. Of the illusion that family sticks together, no matter what. Even when the truth is rotting underneath. I could have sent them the files. I could have dropped every photo, every date, every CPS intake confirmation into the family group chat and watched them squirm. But I didn't. Not because I was ashamed, because I wasn't, but because I knew it wouldn't change anything. They'd made their choice. They chose her. Not the kids. Not the truth. Her. And that hurt, more than I thought it would. Because I wasn't expecting them to thank me. I wasn't expecting parades or applause. But I also didn't expect to be cast out like I was the dangerous one. The destroyer. The traitor. Still, I stood my ground. When my father called the next day, I finally picked up. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't explain. I'm not protecting Sandra anymore, I said simply. I'm protecting Riley and Dylan. And if that makes me the villain in your version of this story, so be it. He didn't respond. Just breathed hard through the phone for a moment before hanging up. That was the last time I heard from most of them. They went silent after that, but not because they understood, because they didn't want to engage with what I'd done. With what it said about all the years they ignored the signs. All the times they dismissed the way Sandra lived. All the moments they chose comfort over confrontation. I didn't care. I had seen blue lips and tear-streaked cheeks. I had smelled the sour air of a home where 2 children were left to fend for themselves. I had watched Dylan cough so hard he couldn't breathe, his little ribs straining beneath a borrowed t-shirt, and I had carried Riley to my car on nights she should have been sleeping in a warm bed in her own room, not curled up on my couch because her mother couldn't be bothered. I wasn't burning bridges. I was walking away from a house already on fire. And if they wanted to call that betrayal, fine. Let them. The court date came faster than I expected. CPS didn't waste time once the file was open. Within days of my report, they began contacting everyone involved, and I could feel the momentum shift. There was no more brushing things under the rug, no more excuses about Sandra being just overwhelmed or going through a rough patch. Everything we'd kept quiet for so long, the missed meals, the empty fridge, the cold nights on strangers' porches, was finally being spoken aloud, written down, entered into official records. The investigator who called me first was kind but firm. She asked direct questions and gave me space to answer them in full. I told her everything, about the night of the Uber incident, about the school calls, about Dylan's illness and the urgent care diagnosis. I gave her the file I'd been building, every photo and message and date-stamped note. She took it all without judgment, just nodded and typed, asking for clarification only when she needed it. She didn't treat me like a bitter sister trying to stir up drama. She treated me like someone who had been holding up too much for too long. They talked to the school next. I found out later that the school nurse gave a full statement about Riley's frequent visits to her office. How sometimes she came in with vague complaints, headaches, stomachaches, but more often, she just asked to sit quietly. How she'd curl up in the cot and refuse to leave until the bell rang. And how, after gentle coaxing, she admitted that the nurse's office felt safe. It was warm. It was quiet. No yelling. No mess. Just silence and soft lighting and someone who paid attention. They spoke to Dorothy, the woman from the Uber night, the stranger who had kept Riley and Dylan on her porch and called me when no one else did. She described how cold the kids were, how Dylan couldn't speak through his chattering teeth, how Riley kept asking if she had the right aunt. She remembered their confusion, their tears. She said she couldn't believe anyone would send children in a car alone without confirming their destination. She said it was one of the most heartbreaking things she'd ever seen. Urgent care provided documentation of Dylan's visit, his temperature, the breathing issues, the signs of untreated bronchitis bordering on pneumonia. The physician's note marked medical neglect, circled in red. That note ended up in the judge's hands. Sandra, of course, tried to play the part. She showed up to court with her hair done and makeup flawless, wearing a soft pastel blouse like she was attending a brunch. She spoke with a cracked voice about how hard single motherhood had been, how she'd lost her support system after our mother died, how she was doing her best and just needed more community. She talked about how deeply she loved her children, how she'd never do anything to harm them, how her difficult sister had always made things harder instead of helping. But the words didn't land. Not the way she wanted. The judge looked at her with a neutrality that didn't bend. It wasn't anger. It was precision. Disbelief measured in silence. When they asked Riley to speak with the court-appointed advocate, she was nervous, but honest. She told them she sometimes said she was sick at school so she could lie down in the nurse's office. So she could have a break. She said she didn't like going home because the house was loud, and she didn't always know what mood mommy would be in. She told them about the night she and Dylan were dropped off in the Uber. How she wasn't sure if I'd be there. How scared she was when she realized it wasn't my house. And Dylan, sweet, quiet Dylan, told the advocate that sometimes he goes to bed with his stomach hurting. That sometimes there's only ketchup in the fridge. That Haley's house has blankets that smell nice and cereal that isn't old. None of it was said with drama. None of it was coached. Just small voices telling the truth that adults had tried to decorate for too long. I sat in the back of that courtroom, my hands folded tightly in my lap, listening to all of it. Every word made my chest tighter. Not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't the only one who saw it. When the judge finally gave his ruling, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He just spoke clearly, concisely, like someone putting an end to a chapter that had gone on too long. Sandra would retain custody, but only under supervision. Regular check-ins. Scheduled visits. Mandatory parenting classes. She would no longer have the right to drop her kids off on a whim. No more disappearing acts. No more wine-soaked nights while her children waited for her to remember them. As for me, the judge acknowledged my involvement with quiet clarity. He granted me expanded visitation rights, overnights, weekends, and the ability to act as emergency contact for both kids. It wasn't full custody. It wasn't permanent. But it was official. It was real. It was protection, on paper. Sandra didn't look at me when the judge finished. She sat perfectly still, lips pursed, hands folded in her lap like she was trying to hold herself together. Maybe she thought her charm would carry her through. Maybe she didn't believe it would ever come to this. I walked out of that courtroom not feeling victorious, but steady. Grounded. The truth had come out. Not in whispers. Not in family fights behind closed doors. But in statements, evidence, testimony. It wasn't just my word against hers anymore. The weight I had carried alone for so long was now shared, acknowledged, confirmed, and answered. It changed everything. The weeks after the court ruling felt strangely quiet. Not the uneasy, waiting for the next crisis kind of quiet that had hung over my life for years, but something else, more solid, more intentional. There were still moments of tension, still the occasional cold silence from extended family, still the sharp sting of knowing how quickly they turned their backs, but around the kids, everything felt different. Not fixed. Not healed. But steadier. Grounded. I became a regular part of their schedule in a way I never had been officially before. Overnight visits weren't just last-minute emergencies or guilt-ridden handoffs anymore, they were planned, consistent, written down. I had a folder in my glove compartment with signed court documents, giving me emergency pickup rights and the authority to make basic medical decisions. I carried copies in my bag, scanned them into my phone. I wasn't just the cool aunt who showed up with snacks and warm coats. I was recognized now, on paper, in law, as someone who mattered. Someone who could step in when it counted. Riley took to the new arrangement quickly. She was always the more aware one, the more cautious, the more internal. She began asking me questions she'd never voiced before, about homework, about lunches, about school projects. Things she used to keep to herself because there was no guarantee anyone would follow through. I started putting a small whiteboard on the fridge at my place, where we'd write down our plans for the week, when they'd stay over, what meals they wanted, what movies we'd watch. Riley started adding to it herself. Drawing little hearts next to Saturday and stars next to Friday night dinners. Dylan, in his own way, adjusted too. He became clingier at first, and I let him. He wanted extra hugs, wanted to be held longer after story time, wanted to help in the kitchen even when his hands were too small to be useful. He started sleeping through the night more often, something that hadn't been consistent before. I noticed the difference in his drawings, too, less chaotic scribbles, more houses, more family scenes. One day he drew a picture of a house with 2 doors and said, "This one's Mommy's. This one's yours. I like yours better, 'cause it's not loud." Sandra, humiliated by the court decision, tried to play the part of a reformed mother. At least on the surface. She cleaned her apartment, scrubbed it, rearranged it, threw away the old wine bottles, even posted a filtered picture of her new mom corner online, complete with a whiteboard schedule and inspirational quotes taped to the wall. She showed up to the parenting classes assigned by the court, or at least she signed the attendance forms. For a while, she even started packing lunches and making it to school pickups on time. But I'd known Sandra too long to be fooled. The performative quality was unmistakable. The way her tone changed whenever a CPS officer was nearby. The way she posted online about her babies after skipping their dentist appointment. The forced smiles when she dropped them off to me, eyes darting behind her as if someone might be watching. She was terrified of losing them completely, not because of what that meant for the kids, but because of what it would mean for her image. I never said anything directly. I didn't confront her. Not then. I just watched. Documented. Quietly, carefully, methodically. I kept the photos coming. I made notes after every visit. I wrote down the dates of every missed pickup, every time the kids came to me with unwashed hair, every time their backpacks were empty of homework folders. I wasn't waiting for her to fall apart. I was preparing for when she inevitably would. But even in that state of vigilance, something unexpected started to happen. The kids began to trust it. It was subtle at first. Riley stopped asking if I was coming back when I dropped her off. She stopped texting me at night from her mom's phone, asking what time I'd be there next. Dylan stopped clinging at the door when I left. They started letting go in ways they hadn't before, little signs that stability was slowly, tentatively, taking root. One night, after I tucked them in during a weekend stay, I found Riley sitting up in bed, quiet but alert. "Do we have to go back to Mommy's?" she asked. "Tomorrow, yes," I said gently, sitting beside her. "But you'll be back here next weekend." She nodded, then looked at me for a long time. It's nicer here. It's not so loud." And Dylan doesn't cry at night here. I didn't know what to say, not right away. I brushed her hair back from her forehead, kissed it, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. You're safe, I told her. Wherever you are, I'll make sure you're safe. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Because this wasn't reactive anymore. It wasn't chaos control. It was structure. It was documented. Protected. Legally supported. I had fought for the right to keep them safe, and I had won, even if it wasn't full custody. The new normal wasn't perfect. It was still fragile. Sandra was still Sandra. The system was still the system. And I still carried the weight of knowing that all of this had to be watched constantly or it might collapse. But Riley and Dylan didn't see that weight. They saw their names on the fridge calendar. They saw a pantry that never went empty. They saw themselves reflected in a home that didn't forget them. And that was enough to keep going. That was enough to hold the line. It didn't take long for the shine to fade. That sanitized version of Sandra, the one who cleaned her apartment for court visits, who smiled through parenting classes, who packed performative lunches for show, slowly dissolved back into the woman I had known all along. At first, it was small things that someone who didn't know her might overlook. A missed homework assignment. A forgotten field trip form. Riley showing up to my apartment on Friday night wearing a sweatshirt that was too thin for the weather, with nothing but a half-eaten bag of chips in her backpack and no change of clothes. I kept telling myself not to jump to conclusions. That maybe this was stress, or fatigue, or one-off week. But I knew the signs. I'd spent my entire adult life reading them. Then came another missed pickup. It was a Tuesday afternoon, cold, windy, with clouds dragging low across the sky. I got a call from the school at 3:35. Sandra hadn't shown. Again. No call, no excuse. Riley and Dylan were sitting in the office, coats on, waiting quietly like they already knew no one was coming. When I got there, Riley didn't even look surprised. Just handed me her backpack and stood up. She said she was coming, she said simply, her voice without blame. I know, I said. I didn't promise anything. I just held her hand. Later that night, I opened the folder I had never stopped updating and added another note. The date. The missed pickup. I took a photo of the form I signed at the school, verifying I was the one who took them home. I attached it to the file. More signs followed. Forgotten dinners. Riley texting me quietly on school nights asking if I had any cereal at my place. Dylan arriving in a t-shirt and shorts in early spring when the temperature still dipped into the 40s. He shivered on the way to my car, trying to pretend he wasn't cold. I wrapped my scarf around his shoulders and said nothing, but I wrote it down that night. The worst came again with Dylan. It always seemed to be Dylan. He was quieter than usual that weekend. Pale. Not quite feverish, but clearly unwell. He kept saying his stomach hurt, that he was tired. When I asked if his mom knew, he shrugged. She said it was nothing, he said, curling up under the blanket on my couch. By Sunday morning, he was coughing. By Sunday night, he was wheezing. I didn't wait. I bundled him up and drove to urgent care, again. The nurse recognized me. Same child, same symptoms, same story. This time it was a respiratory infection, mild, but with potential to turn fast if untreated. The doctor prescribed antibiotics and flagged the visit. Again. I called Sandra the next morning to tell her what had happened, even though I knew better than to expect concern. Jesus, Haley, she said, her voice still groggy. You're so over the top. He just had a cough. It wasn't just a cough, I said, keeping my voice even. He was wheezing. He needed medication. She groaned. You act like I'm trying to hurt them. You need to stop making everything into a crisis. But it wasn't just a crisis anymore. It was a record. A documented, time-stamped, doctor-signed trail of endangerment that could no longer be brushed off as forgetfulness or a bad day. The file I'd started in quiet desperation had grown into something undeniable. And now CPS had more than a call. They had a pattern. Within 48 hours, they followed up. I didn't have to push. I didn't have to beg anyone to listen. They already were. This time it wasn't framed as a warning. There was no suggestion of extra support or temporary oversight. This was a pattern of neglect. This was risk, backed by medical records and school reports and first-hand statements from children who had learned how to stay small to survive. When the social worker called to follow up, her tone had changed. Not aggressive. Not angry. Just definitive. "We've seen enough, Ms. Walker," she said. "We're preparing a full review of Sandra's custody." I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table, staring down at the folder I'd built, the one I never stopped adding to even when the world around me tried to convince me things were fine. And I knew then, this wasn't a cycle that had come back. It had never left. It had never truly broken. Sandra hadn't changed. The chaos hadn't stopped. The system hadn't healed anything, it had simply bought time. And I had to be ready. Always. Because even when things were quiet, even when the masks were up, even when the rooms were clean and the photos were staged, the damage still lived underneath. The neglect didn't stop because it went out of sight. I was tired. So tired. But I wasn't giving up. I had learned how to stay ready. For the knock at the door. For the forgotten pickup. For the next wheezing breath that someone else would have ignored. I wasn't documenting out of spite. I wasn't collecting proof for revenge. I was preparing. Because I had seen what happened when no one did. Years passed in quiet layers. The visits, the pickups, the paperwork, they all blurred into something steady, something rhythmic, something I could track in semesters and shoe sizes. Riley and Dylan, he started asking to be called Mason around 10, and I never questioned it, grew up in the space between two worlds. On paper, Sandra was their mother. But in reality, in the daily textures of their lives, it was me who signed the field trip forms, who remembered the allergy meds, who sat through every parent-teacher conference with a pen in hand and my jaw clenched from holding back frustration at the empty seat beside me. Sandra never really changed. She adjusted, occasionally. Improved under pressure, sure. But it was never internal. Never permanent. Like a faucet that only ran when someone else turned the knob for her. The moment the court's eyes turned away, even slightly, she began to slip. It was always small at first. Missed job interviews. Brief relationships with men who didn't stick around. Overdrawn bank accounts. The utilities getting cut off. She always had a new reason, a new dramatic monologue about betrayal or misfortune. But the core never shifted. The mess was always someone else's fault. The consequences always someone else's to absorb. I kept showing up. Not for her. For them. There were birthdays in my apartment, school supply shopping lists taped to my fridge, and Christmas mornings where I was the one assembling bikes at midnight and writing notes from Santa. Sandra would usually appear halfway through the afternoon with some last-minute gift bag she picked up from a gas station, her perfume too strong, her smile too wide. The kids were polite. They always were. But the air would shift when she walked in, tense, hollow. Like they were bracing for something, even if it never came. By the time Riley turned 16, she stopped asking if her mother was coming. She started staying longer at my place, volunteering to help me with groceries, talking openly about her future. She got a part-time job and handed me half of her paycheck each week without me ever asking, for food, she'd say, with a shrug that was older than her years. At 17, she applied to colleges and listed my address on every application. At 18, she moved in officially. No ceremony. No confrontation. Just packed her things one day and said, "It's easier here. I can breathe." Mason followed later. He waited longer, held on to more of his hope, maybe because he was younger or maybe because the pieces of him that had been ignored needed more time to harden before they could shatter. But the day he turned 20, he brought 2 duffel bags to my door and asked if he could crash, just for a while. He never left. Sandra's world shrank as they stepped out of it. Fewer phone calls. Fewer emergencies. Fewer people willing to listen to her monologues or chase her chaos. She faded, not all at once, not dramatically, but like a signal getting weaker the farther you move from its source. I stopped hearing about her parties. Her boyfriends. Her jobs. She disappeared into her own orbit, untethered. And I built a life that was quiet and solid. I didn't post about it. I didn't call it justice. I didn't frame it as some moral victory. I just kept going. I paid bills. I made dinner. I drove to doctor's appointments. I helped them register for classes. I learned what Riley liked on her sandwiches and how Mason preferred his laundry done. I showed up, day after day, and let that be enough. There were nights when I sat alone after they'd gone to bed, looking around at the home that had grown full without fanfare. Pictures on the fridge. Books left half open on the couch. The sound of Mason's quiet laugh echoing from his room while he played games online with friends. Riley's coffee cup in the sink, her to-do list scribbled on a post-it beside it. None of it glamorous. All of it sacred. I used to beg the world to spare me responsibility. I used to cry from exhaustion, ask why I had to carry the weight someone else had dropped without apology. But over time, without ever quite meaning to, I built something that mattered more than anything I'd ever been asked to do. I didn't win anything. There were no medals. No applause. But I got Riley's trust. Mason's laughter. A home that wasn't chaotic, but warm. And in the end, that was everything. It came slowly, without warning. Not in a dramatic moment, not in some teary confrontation or grand gesture, but in quiet, careful conversations stretched over time. Little acknowledgements that layered themselves into the space between us. Riley had been in college for a year by then, thriving in a way that only made sense if you understood what she came from. Her texts were more frequent now, not out of necessity or desperation, but out of love. She called when she had a rough day, when her classes were overwhelming, when she needed someone to tell her she wasn't alone. And one night, when she came home for winter break, we sat in the living room, her in one of my old sweatshirts, her legs tucked under her, hair pulled into a messy bun, and she looked at me with a stillness I hadn't seen in her since she was a child. I used to pretend I was invisible at Mom's place, she said. I thought if I didn't move too much, didn't make noise, maybe she wouldn't forget me. Maybe she'd remember to pick me up. I didn't say anything. I just listened. But I never had to do that with you, she continued. You always saw me. Even when I didn't know how to ask for help. She paused then, reached over, and rested her hand on mine. Thank you for saving me, she said. Thank you for not letting me disappear. I sat there, the room quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't cry. I didn't respond with some emotional monologue. I just squeezed her hand and nodded, letting the weight of those words settle into the cracks where all the old exhaustion used to live. Mason had his own way of saying it. He never liked heavy conversations, never liked putting words to things he thought might collapse if named. But he called every Sunday without fail. He started doing that his second year after moving in with me, just short check-ins, quick updates about his job, his classes, the friends he'd made. He'd end every call with a casual, love you, tossed in like punctuation, but never empty. I heard the truth in it. The stability. The safety. One Sunday, toward the end of a long conversation, he lingered on the line. You know, he said, I used to wonder why you even bothered. I stayed quiet. But now that I've got my own place, my own life. I get it. You didn't do it because it was easy. You did it because no one else would. That means something. That means everything. He didn't wait for a response. He just told me to take care of myself and hung up. But that was Mason. And that was enough. I think about that night often, the night in December, when I answered a stranger's call about 2 children left on the wrong doorstep in the freezing dark. I think about what might have happened if I hadn't picked up, or if I had dismissed it as someone else's problem, or if I had let myself keep saying yes, while dying inside just to avoid a confrontation. But I didn't. I said no. I said enough. I said this ends here. And back then, the world turned on me for it. I became the villain in a story no one wanted to rewrite. I was called cold. Jealous. Disloyal. Family was supposed to come first, they said. Blood is thicker. You don't call CPS. You don't air dirty laundry. You don't shame your own. But now, all these years later, with Riley thriving and Mason grounded, with their voices steady and their hearts intact, I know the truth. I wasn't the villain. I was the line in the sand. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I wasn't punishing Sandra. I wasn't doing it to be right. I was doing it because someone had to stop the bleeding. Someone had to say, with clarity and conviction, that children deserve better than chaos disguised as love. That responsibility isn't something you wait to inherit. That stability is an act of love. That safety is a choice you fight for. And I chose. That night. That phone call. That trembling little voice on the other end of the line saying, "We're cold." I chose. And now, years later, I look around my home and see their photos on the wall. Riley in her graduation gown. Mason grinning from the driver's seat of his first car. Their faces lit not by fear or confusion, but by joy. By the quiet freedom that comes from knowing you are safe and seen. This was never about taking something away from Sandra. It was about giving Riley and Mason a chance to grow up whole. And that was worth everything.